Robert Fico admitted that in the future he might, like Viktor Orbán, block EU loans of 90 billion euros for Ukraine. The Prime Minister of Slovakia supported his Hungarian counterpart, arguing this by citing the halt of Russian oil supplies through the Druzhba pipeline. According to Fico, Orbán is supposedly politically right, saying that Zelensky cannot run the European Union. The Prime Minister of Slovakia reiterated his point that the shutdown of the Druzhba oil pipeline is caused solely by political reasons and hatred toward Russia. According to him, Russian oil will supposedly strengthen the energy security of the European continent.
Let's discuss this topic with Lyudmila Pokravchuk, Doctor of Philosophy, expert in external and internal policies. Hello, thank you for joining us.
Hello there, how are you?
Hello.
Lyudmila, I've been reading a number of international media outlets, Hungarian media, Slovak media, and absolutely all of them, as if in unison, say, I'm referring to quotes from Fico and Orbán, that the supply of energy resources through the Druzhba oil pipeline is a matter of economic survival. Moreover, right now I'm summarizing for you in one sentence what is said in many, many, many articles. Besides the fact that for Hungary and Slovakia this is an existential issue, that Europe in principle will not survive without Russian oil, that's a direct quote from Orbán. It is also said that giving up Russian gas and oil will lead to a catastrophic increase in prices for the people. So, am I understanding correctly that there is such a huge difference between the price of Russian oil and the alternatives, for example, the ones offered by Croatia? They say that we can fully cover all the necessary needs. Yes, all the necessary supplies for Hungary at a different price, but is the difference really that big? Why are Orbán and Fico focusing attention specifically on this? Could you please explain?
Well, basically, there are two slightly different situations with Hungary and Slovakia, because in Hungary there are elections, and on the 12th of April, literally just around the corner, it will already be clear whether the anti-Ukrainian campaign that Orbán has been running in Hungary has worked. That's why we've said that the closer it gets to the elections, of course, the more his rhetoric will intensify regarding Ukraine. And if we, move on specifically to the question you mentioned, yes, the economic one, then basically they were getting Russian oil at 30% less than the price at which it is supplied to Europe. Well, can you imagine that? That is, the cheapest oil in Europe was the one supplied to Hungary and Slovakia. But let's not forget, Russia signs individual contracts, right, with each country separately, and certain perks for each country were also negotiated separately. So, I mean, we all remember perfectly well how it all was, right? Both gas and oil for Russia are not just economic resources, but also major political assets. That's why there were not only many economic perks built into these contracts, of course, with Hungary and Slovakia. It's clear why Slovakia is sounding the alarm, right? Ringing the bells. Because after all, they have heavy industry that depends on energy resources, especially considering that their only oil refinery in Slovakia received oil specifically from the Druzhba pipeline. But nevertheless, you know, if we also look at the economic aspect, yes, we're not saying this is all in principle a political issue, right? Because economically, all of this could have been diversified without any problem. Even today, regarding Slovakia, the Czech Republic has already proposed, let's set up a reverse flow on your pipeline. And considering that the Czech Republic, for example, which also used to receive the maximum amount of Russian oil, has in fact diversified by 2024 and 2025. And today its main suppliers are basically Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, and also the United States. So all of this could have been done if these countries had the desire to do so. But we perfectly understand that for both Orbán and Fico, this whole topic of energy resources is primarily a political issue, aside from the economic aspect, of course, because after all, someone needs to be blamed for the difficulties that are currently happening in these two countries. And in general, of course, especially within the European Union itself, against the backdrop of what happened in the Middle East when energy prices spiked. And let's not forget, especially in the case of Slovakia, why such a harsh statement is being made right now. Because there was just information that the Slovak National Gas Company, specifically the gas company, is negotiating with Gazprom to increase supplies up to 100%. So even though, as we all know very well, the European Union has made a decision to completely remove Russian gas from the EU market, Well, nevertheless, there are certain loopholes that these countries use, and Slovakia in particular takes advantage of them. And right now, these negotiations are happening at full speed, where there are very strong agreements being made, especially regarding gas delivered through pipelines. Turkish. And in addition to all that, there are also other alternative sources. But right now, it specifically concerns Russian gas. So all of this ties into the fact that Slovakia and Hungary, well, they are not going to give up Russian energy resources. That's already becoming clear. This is just their policy of blackmailing the European Union. And what are they using to carry out all this blackmail? Of course, who is to blame for all this? Of course, it's Ukraine's fault. They're the ones blocking everything. Although everyone in the European Union understands perfectly well what happened with the Druzhba pipeline, nevertheless, these two countries are now playing this political card to the fullest. Let's not forget, especially Hungary, which is echoing Russia's position. And Russia, considering that certain sanctions on its energy resources are now being lifted, not just on oil, by the way, but now there's already talk about gas with the Americans planning to lift those as well. Of course, when it gets a certain green light, well, let's keep putting pressure right in the middle of Europe, and maybe we'll push through this issue of restoring relations between the European Union and the Russian Federation regarding energy resources. Well, let's start with Hungary and Slovakia, who it's pretty clear in principle why they're doing all this, because they used to receive supplies through the pipeline. Their economies, especially Slovakia's, I should note again, are based on automotive manufacturing and heavy industry. So they always appeal to these factors. And that's why we can tie this, I'm saying, even to the issue of the Russian Federation, because, well, just making these statements that Orbán and Fico make, like, that's it, we won't receive anything, and as you said, our economy will collapse. No, that's not the case. Many economists say this as well. By the way, even Slovakia's own Minister of Economy has also stated that if there are no deliveries through Druzhba, it is entirely possible to diversify. The same goes for Hungary. We know how much the European Union has already offered Hungary to both compensate and diversify. As I said, if there were a will, but there simply isn't any desire. And today, these political statements, of course, have a maximum impact on the electoral field, both in Slovakia and in Hungary, because someone needs to be blamed for what is happening, for why energy prices are rising so much. Well, of course, who? Of course, it's easiest to blame someone else, to find an external enemy. And the external enemy, well, that's Ukraine, since the pipeline, the Druzhba pipeline, runs through its territory, and it's that section which Ukraine has shut off. And, well, Russia, of course, is also manipulating these two countries as much as possible, I should note, simply in order to re-enter the energy markets of Europe, of course. Because we need to clearly understand that for Russia, no matter how much it claims to have diversified its markets, or that the European market was not that significant for it, and that now they've supposedly replaced everything very well. No, it's precisely the European markets that they want to return to more than ever, because the wealthiest market was, of course, the one provided by Europe. We remember very well how difficult it was for Europe to get off this needle, as we used to say, the energy needle of the Russian Federation, to completely break away from it. And even now, we see that it's not completely done yet. There are two countries that are now trying as much as possible to destabilize the European Union from within, especially considering, I should also point out, the problems that have arisen in the global energy sector due to the situation in the Middle East. That they will continue to stir up this situation is obvious. Orbán, for example, will definitely keep it up until April 12th, and during this time, the anti-Ukrainian rhetoric will only intensify. And as for Fico, it's because he needs to get some leniency from the European Union, particularly regarding the contract with Gazprom. And of course, well, he still desperately wants to continue to get cheap Russian oil, because he fully understands that if he ever has to replace it, well, his entire industry, this very large energy and economic cluster that currently exists in Slovakia, simply won't be able to withstand the global competition. They haven't yet reoriented their national economy to function properly without Russian oil. It was always fully factored into their plans. Russian oil was deeply built into the entire cost structure of this vital industrial sector, which remains one of the absolute main sectors in the country of Slovakia today.
So I would also like to point out, as I see it, that for the Russian Federation, on the contrary, it is actually beneficial to keep Hungary and Slovakia, as they say, on the hook. It's not profitable to sell cheap oil, but rather it's beneficial to attack the Druzhba oil pipeline again, so that Hungary and Slovakia can endlessly blackmail Ukraine with various barriers. This could concern, as it did this time, yes, the loan from the European Union and so on, all the more so since, yes, as Zelensky said, well, 2 months, there were specialists from the European Union, and about 2 months are needed to repair this oil pipeline. That's it. And that's why it's obvious that there is much more politics than economics when it comes to Russian oil. But despite Hungary's resistance, and possibly, as Fico says, Slovakia's as well, the European Union is making it clear that financial support for Ukraine will be provided in any case. The head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, stated directly that the EU will find a way to allocate a loan of 90 billion euros to Ukraine, one way or another. This statement came after a difficult summit in Brussels, where European leaders failed to persuade Prime Minister Viktor Orbán to lift the blockade. And how do you assess what these, let's say, alternative sources of lending to Ukraine might be?
Well, in principle, this has already been discussed, and there was a certain proposal that not this amount, yes, the 90 billion, but that it would basically be taken from other, programs. Well, this will also be this is also part of the budget of the European Union's budget program, where funds are specifically allocated for such situations, yes, which are difficult and happen in relation to countries that are, candidates for EU membership. Basically, there are certain funds allocated there. So it's not such a large amount all at once, but it can be provided in certain installments. Why do people say that this will definitely be provided? Because such amounts from other sources do not require a consensus vote, since it's not. It's simply an economic issue for relatively small sums. And here, basically, just a simple majority of votes is enough. This is basically according to the procedure that exists in the European Union. Therefore, Orbán's veto here, of course, won't play any role. It will simply be decided by a majority vote, and there is a majority. Of course, when you have this large sum, it's easier because you really understand that you've received it and you already have a roadmap calculated for where these funds will go and how they will be allocated. In other words, there is already an understanding for several years ahead. But when it comes to these smaller amounts, of course, you have to find this sum each time. It always has to be approved by a majority vote, and you still need to gather the leaders and have them vote by majority. Of course, the procedure is more complicated, but if that's how it turns out, well, we'll see on the 12th what happens. Although, it will still take some time for everything to settle down in Hungary, even after the elections, that will also take time. So most likely what Ursula von der Leyen stated is true, that it will be done in small amounts over several stages. But besides that, no one has refused this loan. No one has said it won't be unblocked. It's still on the agenda. And that's good because, well, we'll see how things go from here, of course. But right now, what was promised to us until the end of April, we definitely need certain funding because this loan in particular was tied to our defense sector. The main thing we remember, there were these portions, 60% of it was for the defense sector, which is what this loan was for. Of course, and now more than ever, we need this very funding. That's why I think that the European Union, there are enough, as I said, there are programs that take into account the difficulties faced by countries that, I'll emphasize again, are candidates for membership. And here, of course, a consensus vote is not required. I think that this amount will simply be allocated, and perhaps in principle, it might not even require a majority vote, but just certain technical procedures by the European Commission.
Lyudmila, literally 30 seconds. We will soon have the nationwide minute of silence. Please explain, in your opinion, if we talk about Hungary now, could Hungary's position completely change after April 12th in the event of Péter Magyar's victory? Based on your analysis, your observations of Péter Magyar, his position and political doctrine?
Well, as for a complete turnaround regarding Ukraine, of course not a full 180 degrees, but that the position will be softened is certain because Magyar does not want to be associated with Orbán. He doesn't need that because it would immediately lead to renewed political destabilization in Hungary, which Viktor Orbán himself would exploit if he loses all this. And Magyar might simply not be able to hold on. Magyar doesn't need that. And he will do everything possible to avoid being compared to Orbán, to avoid people saying he's just like Orbán, right? And of course he will, since Orbán's rhetoric was specifically election-oriented and anti-Ukrainian. Magyar will need to present something completely different, right? Although we know that the difficulties between us and Hungary, of course, will not be completely eliminated yet, as you said, it will still take time. But as far as the European Union is concerned, I think the rhetoric will be softened, and as they say, we will start building a new approach to the relationship between Hungary and Ukraine.
Well, yes, especially since it is important for Ukraine that there are at least no obvious blockages of any decisions by the European Union, not just for Ukraine's basic functioning, but for its survival in this aggressive war that Russia is waging against Ukraine. Thank you very much, Lyudmila, for joining us. Lyudmila Pokravchuk, PhD, expert on foreign and domestic policy, was with us. Lyudmila,